It begins not with fire or flood, but with silence, a silence that spreads across continents, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. 2.5 million years ago, the planet entered one of the most dramatic turning points in its history. The skies dimmed with dust carried from expanding deserts, and the once lush forests of Africa began to fade into scattered islands of green. Something profound was happening, something that would redefine the destiny of every living creature that walked, crawled, or flew upon this changing world. The rhythm of the planet faltered. What had been a balance of warmth and rain shifted toward chaos. Seasons stretched and broke, droughts deepened, glaciers formed in the north, draining the tropics below. Rivers that had once carved the land into veins of life now cracked into desolation. The earth was reshaping itself, and every species had to decide, adapt or vanish. In this crucible of change, evolution became relentless. Forests gave way to savannas, open fields of golden grass shimmering beneath an unforgiving sun. The creatures that once thrived under the canopy now stood exposed. For them, shade meant survival, and its loss meant extinction. The old rules no longer worked. Survival now belonged to those who could think, move, and evolve. Amid this planetary upheaval, a fragile figure appeared on the horizon, upright, curious, uncertain. Our early ancestors, the hominins, began their struggle in a world that seemed determined to erase them. They walked farther each day in search of water, scanned the skies for signs of rain, and learned to read the land not just with instinct, but with thought. For the first time, survival was no longer about strength alone. It was about intelligence. Picture it, a blazing sun above, the air thick with dust and heat. You can almost feel the tension between the past that's dying and the future that's being born. Because out of this harsh new world came a question that still echoes through time. What would you do to survive when the planet itself turns against you? Before we step deeper into this prehistoric world, take a moment to imagine yourself there. If you could walk those plains, would you endure or fade with the old world? Like this video if you'd fight to survive, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think was the hardest challenge our ancestors faced? The hunger, the predators, or the changing earth itself? The transformation was not sudden. It crept across the land like a slow breath of time. The jungles that once covered eastern Africa began to thin, their canopy breaking apart until sunlight touched the forest floor for the first time in ages. Trees that had towered for centuries withered beneath skies that no longer promised steady rain. In their place rose endless plains of grass, whispering with the wind, the birth of the savannas. For the creatures that called this place home, it was the end of one world and the reluctant beginning of another. Where thick forests once offered safety and abundance, now stretched an open horizon filled with danger. Every movement was visible, every shadow a potential predator. The mighty apes, once masters of the trees, descended into uncertainty. Some clung to the remnants of the forest, hoping the rains would return. Others dared to step out, into the light, into the unknown. This new land was a paradox, barren yet full of opportunity. Herds of grazing animals, from early antelopes to massive elephants, began to thrive in the open fields. With them came the hunters, great saber-toothed cats, prehistoric hyenas, and packs of opportunistic scavengers. The balance of life rewrote itself on these plains. To survive here meant adapting to sight, to sound, to movement, to a life without shelter. And among those who watched and learned were the early hominins. They stood at the edge of the shrinking forests, observing this vast new world. It was alien, dangerous, and yet full of promise. Here, they could see farther. They could plan. The open landscape demanded awareness. It sharpened senses, stretched endurance, and rewarded cooperation. The savanna didn't just reshape the earth's surface, it began to reshape the mind. Every step into the grasslands was a gamble, a test of courage and ingenuity. But each step also marked progress, the first footprints toward what would one day become civilization. Because in leaving the trees behind, our ancestors didn't just adapt to the savanna, they began to master it. And as the sun blazed down on this new world, something extraordinary was stirring in the dust. The birth of intelligence itself. Across the sweeping plains of the Pleistocene dawn, the earth was alive with giants. Massive beasts roamed under skies of burning blue, relics of an older age now forced to confront a world that was changing faster than ever before. Strength alone was no longer enough. This was the age of adaptation, and even the mightiest would be tested. Herds of ancient elephants, their tusks spiraling like ivory sabers, wandered in search of water that grew rarer each year. Among them, the colossal Dinotherium, a creature that looked like it had stepped from a myth, carried its downward curving tusks like weapons of the gods. Nearby, enormous grazing beasts tore at the dry grass, their heavy steps shaking the ground. The land trembled not with earthquakes, but with life struggling to endure. But even the giants had enemies. In the tall grass lurked predators built for precision, saber-tooths with fangs like daggers, and hyenas the size of lions. Every hunt was a clash between titans, each one sculpted by necessity, by the merciless logic of evolution. The savanna became a theater of survival, where only those who could adapt to the rhythm of drought and scarcity would leave descendants behind. Among these colossi moved smaller, fragile shapes, the early hominins. Compared to the beasts around them, they were insignificant. No claws, no armor, no speed. Yet they watched, they learned. They began to understand that power did not come from muscle alone, but from foresight, from strategy, from unity. In the shadows of the giants, a different kind of evolution was unfolding, one that relied not on size, but on mind. As the dry season deepened, carcasses littered the plains, feeding the circling vultures. Survival had become a contest of adaptation, and even the rulers of the past were beginning to fall. The world was rewriting its hierarchy, slowly, brutally, inevitably. And at the bottom of that chain, something small and determined was rising. Because as the great beasts fought to endure the heat and hunger, the seeds of human resilience were already taking root. The giants would dominate the land for now, but the future, fragile, clever, and endlessly curious, was watching from the dust. They were not kings of the plains. They were not even predators. They were, survivors, frail silhouettes crossing the sun-scorched land, driven by hunger and thirst. Our earliest ancestors, the hominins of 2.5 million years ago, lived in a world that offered no mercy. The rains had failed. The lakes had shrunk into cracked bowls of dust. The wind carried only the scent of dry earth and decay. Yet still, they walked. By day, they followed the footprints of elephants and antelopes, hoping those massive wanderers might lead them to hidden waterholes. By night, they huddled in silence, listening to the low roars of predators who ruled the darkness. There was no fire to protect them yet, only the faint comfort of numbers. The first bonds of cooperation were born not from love, but from fear. Food was scarce. Every scrap of meat left behind by a predator meant a chance to live another day. And so, they waited at the edges of hunts, watching lions and hyenas tear into their prey. When the killers moved on, these fragile creatures crept forward with stone, flakes, crude, sharp, and revolutionary. The first tools. The first sign that survival could be shaped by will. In their eyes burned something new, awareness. They began to understand the patterns of their world, the migration of animals, the timing of the rains, the rhythm of life and death. They learned that together they could do what alone was impossible. Slowly, they began to think like a species that would one day outlast all others. Picture them now, gaunt, exhausted, yet unbroken. Beneath a dying sun, they share a scrap of meat, the spoils of courage and patience. This is where humanity truly began, not in triumph, but in endurance. The will to keep walking, to keep searching, even when the world seemed determined to erase them. And that spark, the one that refuses to die, still burns within us. The same hunger for survival, the same hope that tomorrow will bring something better. If you had to survive in their world, with no fire, no shelter, and no certainty, what would drive you forward? Hunger, hope, or fear? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The sun ruled the land like a tyrant. Each dawn rose with a glare that burned through the horizon, stripping color from the world. What had once been rivers were now scars of cracked clay, stretching for miles in silence. Every creature, from the smallest insect to the mightiest beast, was bound by a single desperate truth. Without water, there was no life. For our ancestors, water meant movement. They followed dry riverbeds, chasing the ghost of moisture buried beneath the dust. They learned to read the land, the patterns of trees that hinted at underground springs, the cries of birds that betrayed a distant oasis. Sometimes these journeys led to salvation, other times to death. Around the last remaining pools, competition was brutal. Herds clashed, predators lurked, and humans, weak, unarmed, and fragile, had to wait until the chaos subsided to claim what was left. The droughts shaped not only their bodies but their minds. Thirst became the first teacher of strategy. To survive, they moved in groups, timed their searches, and began to communicate in ways more complex than before. A glance, a gesture, a sound. These small sparks of understanding bound them together. Cooperation was no longer an option. It was evolution's demand. But even unity could not always overcome the cruelty of the dry season. There were days when the wind itself tasted of salt and ash. Days when the mirage of water tempted them toward death. They buried their dead in shallow earth, then continued walking, because to stop was to surrender. Yet, amid the suffering, something profound began to take shape. The droughts that threatened to destroy them also forged resilience, memory, and foresight. The search for water was no longer just instinct, it became purpose. They began to recognize the rhythm of the land, to sense the coming of the rains before the clouds appeared. Nature had turned against them, but in doing so, it had made them stronger. And one day, as the thunder finally broke the silence and the first drops struck the parched ground, the earth came alive once more. Grass burst through the soil, rivers began to flow, and the air filled with the scent of renewal. But for those who had endured, something had changed forever. They had learned to survive the absence of mercy. And in that lesson lay the secret of humanity's endurance, the will to seek water, even in a world of dust. In the vast savannas of a restless earth, a quiet revolution was unfolding. The age of brute strength was giving way to the age of observation. Our ancestors, still fragile among giants, began to master a new form of survival: patience. They were not yet hunters in the modern sense. They lacked the speed of a lion, the fangs of a saber-tooth, the claws of a raptor. But they had something no other creature possessed: the ability to wait, to watch, to understand. When predators struck, tearing through herds in a blur of blood and dust, the early humans stayed hidden, memorizing every movement. They learned which animals killed first and which left scraps behind. Then, when the chaos faded and the killers vanished, they approached, careful, silent, determined. Scavengers, yes, but strategic ones. With crude stone tools, they cracked open bones too thick for other animals to break. Inside lay a treasure, marrow, dense with fat and nutrients, the fuel that would feed their, growing brains. Every strike of stone against bone was an act of defiance against extinction. They had no territory, no dominance, only opportunity. And that, in this unforgiving world, was enough. Over time, opportunity turned into innovation. They began to anticipate hunts, following predators from a distance, reading the landscape like a book written in blood and instinct. The savanna was no longer just a stage of danger. It became a map of possibilities. Cooperation deepened. Some would distract scavengers while others harvested meat. Even communication evolved, shaped by the need to share danger, to coordinate, to survive together. Through this cunning, our ancestors began to transform their place in the chain of life. They were still small, still vulnerable, but their minds had begun to awaken to something greater: foresight. For the first time, survival wasn't just reaction, it was strategy, and that changed everything. The wind carried the scent of carrion and dust, the ideal air thick with the rhythm of life and death. But amid that primal chaos, a new predator was quietly being born, one that would eventually dominate the world, not through claws or muscle, but through thought. Night once belonged to predators. When the sun fell, the world turned dangerous, a chorus of roars and eyes glowing in the dark. For millions of years, our ancestors huddled together in silence, waiting for dawn. But then, something extraordinary happened. A spark, accidental, fragile, fleeting, changed everything. No one knows exactly when the first flame was tamed. Perhaps it was lightning striking a dry tree, or embers carried from a distant wildfire. But when our ancestors gathered around that trembling light, something inside them shifted. The fire pushed back the night. It transformed fear into warmth and darkness into safety. For the first time, the humans of the plains could see beyond the stars. Fire did more than protect. It united. Around its glow, the first stories may have been spoken, the first laughter shared. The flame became a symbol of cooperation, of trust. To keep it alive required care, patience, and teamwork. In the dance of shadows cast by the firelight, humanity found its first sense of community. It also changed the body. Cooked meat delivered more energy, fueling larger brains. The day's hunt no longer ended at dusk. The night became a time of planning, of reflection, of connection. Fire turned survival into culture. But the power of flame came with a new kind of awareness. It gave humans the ability to shape their environment, to claim dominion over nature itself. For the first time, they weren't just reacting to the world, they were transforming it. Imagine that moment: the crackle of wood, the flicker of light against the eyes of creatures that once hid in fear. It wasn't just heat or safety. It was the birth of civilization, glowing faintly in the dark. If you had been there, watching fire for the first time, what do you think you would have felt? Fear? Awe? Or the realization that nothing would ever be the same again? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The savannah was never silent. Even the wind seemed to whisper of danger. Every shadow could hide death. Every step across the tall grass could draw the gaze of something watching, waiting. This was the age of predators, a time when the world belonged to teeth and instinct, when survival itself was an act of defiance. Saber-toothed cats stalked the Yadir plains like phantoms, their long fangs gleaming in the light of dawn. Massive hyenas hunted in packs, their laughter echoing through the valleys, not the timid scavengers of the modern world, but relentless killers capable of taking down creatures 10 times their size. Crocodiles lurked in the shrinking rivers, jaws wide as traps, patient as time. Even the air carried menace, vultures circling above, marking where life would soon give way to death. And amid this living gauntlet walked humanity, barefoot, weaponless, exposed. But they were learning. They began to study the habits of their enemies, to understand their patterns. When to hide, when to move, when to strike. The savannah was not just a landscape, it was a classroom, and every predator was a teacher. The early humans watched lions coordinate their attacks and began to mimic them. They learned to move in silence, to communicate without sound. They discovered that fear could be used, that by standing together, by appearing, larger, louder, more unified, they could drive even the fiercest hunter away. For the first time, cooperation was not only a tool for survival, it was a weapon. Still, death was never far. One careless step, one moment of hesitation, and the balance shifted. The night carried screams, the dust carried bones. But in that endless contest between predator and prey, something inside humanity hardened. The fear that once paralyzed began to evolve into something sharper: awareness, strategy, courage. By facing the predators of this ancient earth, our ancestors became something more than survivors. They became thinkers, planners, beings who could imagine the future and act before it arrived. The age of predators was brutal, but it forged the first warriors, the first leaders, the first glimmers of what would one day become civilization itself. By now, survival was no longer a matter of luck. It was a game of decisions, of thought. The savannas that had once seemed endless and unpredictable began to take shape in the minds of early humans as something more, a system that could be understood, anticipated, and even controlled. This was the birth of strategy, the dawn of the human mind as we know it. They began to move differently across the land, not wandering aimlessly, but with purpose. They learned to predict where herds would migrate when the rains returned, when predators would hunt, when the rivers would vanish again. The world was still wild, but it was no longer entirely mysterious. For the first time, humanity was beginning to think ahead. Stone tools evolved from crude flakes into deliberate designs. Each cut, each edge, served a purpose. The first hunters began to plan ambushes, using terrain and timing to their advantage. What they lacked in power, they replaced with intellect. A group of small, upright creatures had learned to outthink the giants that had ruled before them. Fire, cooperation, and communication became the building blocks of something extraordinary. Around the campfires, they began to share experiences, not just food but ideas. Knowledge was passed from one generation to the next, memories preserved through stories and imitation. They were no longer merely surviving. They were creating culture, and with strategy came identity. They began to see themselves not just as individuals, but as part of something larger, a collective intelligence shaped by struggle. The droughts, the hunts, the predators, all of it had forged the same lesson. Unity and foresight meant survival. In the glow of the firelight, the first traces of human ingenuity flickered into being. They were no longer prey pretending to be safe. They were thinkers dreaming of control, and that dream, fragile, invisible, unstoppable, would one day carry them to the ends of the earth. The night stretched on, filled with the murmurs of the tribe and the crackle of flame. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time, humanity was ready to meet them with more than instinct. It was armed with imagination. It began as survival and became destiny. By the time the Ice Age tightened its grip, the world was colder, harsher, and more unpredictable than ever before. But humanity had changed. What had once been a small, frightened creature wandering beneath the feet of giants was now something entirely new, a being capable of shaping the future. They had fire. They had tools. They had each other. And for the first time, they had understanding, the awareness that life was more than endurance. Around campfires that flickered beneath vast, star-filled skies, they began to share not just warmth, but meaning. Each flame reflected in their eyes was a memory of everything they had conquered: drought, hunger, predators, and fear. They had learned to read the land, to follow the rains, to use the bones of fallen beasts as weapons and tools. They turned stone into purpose. The savanna, once a landscape of terror, had become their home. And from that home, they would one day cross mountains, rivers, and seas, spreading the spark of their resilience to every corner of the earth. This was not the story of dominance. It was the story of endurance. The droughts that once tried to erase them had instead written the blueprint of who we are: adaptable, curious, unyielding. Each trial forced them to evolve, not just in body, but in spirit. They learned to share, to teach, to hope. And that more than anything is what made us human. Look at the world today: shifting climates, rising heat, uncertain skies. The echoes of that ancient struggle still surround us. Our ancestors faced a planet that demanded change, and they answered not with despair, but with innovation and unity. The same spark that once lit the first fire still burns within us. The drive to adapt, to endure, to build a future even when the odds stand against us. As we face our own age of shifting climates and uncertain tomorrows, ask yourself, what will we do with the fire we've inherited? Because survival, as our ancestors proved, is not just about living through the storm. It's about learning to rise from it, stronger, wiser, and never the same again.